as Jack said, the field of what happens after civil resistance supposedly ends and then successfully and then transition starts is under-researched, and it's an exciting field. And as you know, there are a number of examples that actually makes a connection between civil resistance and successful transition, and there are a number of examples which makes connection between civil resistance and unsuccessful transition. So I wanted to touch upon this, and I want to talk with you about what is needed for successful transition and how exactly civil resistance may matter during the transition, despite the fact that the first phase of transition of civil resistance ended. And I want to start from the question which I would like to ask you. What do you think? What kind of factors, issues will determine successful transition for you? And if you can name a couple of them, that will move our discussion forward.
Political fractures in the state.
Political?
Fractures in the state.
Right, so political fragmentation, divisions, or lack of thereof.
Yeah.
Okay.
Existence of leadership.
Existence of leadership with perhaps pro-democracy agenda. Yes.
Well, and consent within political parties and powers.
Consensus.
Political consensus, yeah.
Right. So it's like fragmentation and lack of fragmentation because there is certain consensus about what needs to be done.
The delicate balance of going for justice or for keeping impunity when it comes to war crimes or atrocities committed by the two sides or by both sides in conflict.
Right. Restorative justice issues.
Strong civil society organizations.
Okay. Civil society organizations. Joe?
Two things essentially, and one, you have to make sure that the former regime members are not at all involved in fomenting disorder. They usually are. So that's one main goal, is bringing down the old regime through law or through purification courts, as historically has been the case, or what have you. The second thing is actually the leadership putting forward a plan and for transition, putting forward a strong kind of roadmap, if you will.
Okay. Let's go.
All the major players regard that democracy as the only game in town.
So there is only one alternative, democratic path.
Right.
There is only one alternative, which is the democratic path. And there is no experimentation with other kind of possible systems of governments.
Commitment on behalf of not only civil society organizations but also different other institutions, even people involvement, and commitment on behalf of people as well.
Great.
Unity of social classes and social groupings within society based on religion, income, anything.
Right, low level of social cleavages. Important. Yes.
I think a rights-based approach in terms of transparency, inclusivity, and accountability.
That would be usually guaranteed by a certain legal norms and legal framework. Okay, you name actually all, I guess. Let's see. That's what the experts in the literature on democratization, that's what they would stress. They would say about external influence. Some of the experts are saying that countries that are geographically closer to democracies would have better chances of democratization. They talk about geographical proximity. So, for example, countries in Central Europe had better chances of democratization, but because they were adjacent to democracies, in contrast to, for example, countries in Caucasus or Central Asia. That was one of the kind of explanations that you can find in the literature. Low level of social privileges and lower level of kind of inequalities, that would facilitate democratization. Some would say that you establish free economy, not a crony capitalism or feudal capitalism that would redistribute equally wealth, which would then reduce the social inequalities that again facilitates successful democratization. Some would say the existence of middle class, the larger middle class, the greater stability and probability for democratic transition. Political tradition. Some people would say that the presence of experience in kind of democratic decision making in kind of decades ago kind of helps to come back to the democracy and kind of reestablish democracy if that tradition was present earlier. But oftentimes this goes into very kind of racist arguments that some regions are not ready for democracy, and that was the argument made about Latin America, Asia, and Middle East, that they didn't have that experience previous with political kind of democracy as a part of their tradition. That's why it's very unlikely that they would succeed in establishing or building democracy. Some people would stress the issue of electoral infrastructure, building procedures that would guarantee fair and free elections, right sequencing of reforms, whether first you will have constitutional reform, political reform, or perhaps you will start from economic, social reforms, independent judiciary, independent media, pro-democracy political leaders, which you mentioned, civilian control over the armed forces, and some would stress the issue of kind of a balanced distribution of political power between different branches of the government, as well as between the center and the kind of the periphery. And some experts are pointing to Russia as saying that because of the accumulation power in presidential system that created supra-presidentialism, the democratic transition was not very successful in Russia. Well, if you look at those, at all those points, you see that they are very kind of top-down, institutional. They are very kind of structure-based, and oftentimes the factors that we have little influence over. I mean, I have really little influence what my grandparents did in terms of democracy or not, in terms of political tradition. And you did mention another important aspect, which I think is crucial for, and that would be kind of the thesis of my presentation, which is crucial for transition, which is civil society. But my argument goes that this is not a kind of usual civil society that we would expect to have in order for that democratization to be successful or to move forward. I would argue that what is needed, it's rebellious civil society. And it's the civil society that is that remains non-violent but is militant, that is peaceful but is at the same time challenging and kind of requiring the government essentially to move with the reforms and very much engaged. So I will be referring to rebellious civil society in my presentation in later slides. Why it's so crucial to have rebellious civil society? A couple of thoughts on that, starting from the dangers of having a quiet, actually, civil society. When you look at the transitions, oftentimes those transitions failed because actually there was a demobilized civil society. And this demobilization happens through two processes, as I see, by co-optation and alienation. And I think when I look at an example of Georgia and Ukraine, this is actually what exactly happened with civil society. In Georgian case, it was co-optation of civil society, where civic space was overtaken by political space. Most of the leaders of the Rose Revolution joined the government, and no one was left to in the civil society to kind of provide a certain civic energy to press the political leaders to adopt necessary reforms. In terms of alienation, that's what actually happened with civil society in Ukraine, where democratic political leaders alienated civil society that withdrew from being politically active into different economic and social spheres. But because they withdrew, again, they didn't play the role they could in terms of pressing political leaders to implement political reforms. And most importantly, when you see demobilized civil society, we see that there is a lack of diffusion of political power within the system, the one that I mentioned about in terms of distributing that power more as in a balanced way between executive and legislative, and that would also oftentimes follow decentralization, which I would argue that they are one of the most important reforms in order for that to have successful democratization, that the concentration of political power and decentralization of political power. At the same time, because of the mobilized civil society, I think the political leaders are missing that window of opportunity, which is really 2-3 years after the change. This is the window of opportunity on average that awaits the leaders to use in order to implement necessary political, social, economic reforms before that window closes and the society becomes more and more dissatisfied. Now, touching upon the rebellious nature of civil society, my argument goes that this is important because of the kind of new social contract that is emerging during the transition while we face with the rebellious civil society. And that new social contract is very healthy for implementing successful economic reforms. First of all, the old social contract that usually would exist in authoritarian systems before civil kind of resistance would take place, which is based really on the notion of passivity for security. We stayed passive, we stayed obedient because the government is providing some sort of physical, personal, or kind of economic security. At least, till the moment we would define this type of security as actually insecurity. When the government is unable to provide the basic kind of physical and welfare security, then the passivity changes into more kind of active form and rebellion occurs. What happens exactly in transition, as I see, is the emergence of a different type of legitimacy, which I called active legitimacy, based on this kind of rebellious nature of civil society, that essentially it's conferred, this active legitimacy is conferred by civil society, by rebellious civil society, on the government in exchange for two things: accountability and responsiveness. Accountability understood as a demand that the government explains what it does and what it doesn't to the public. That it goes there and explains why it adopted certain policies or why it didn't adopt. This is the kind of exchange that society would expect from the government while it provides this active legitimacy. And another exchange is responsiveness. It's essentially the question of how well the government, while it's delivering or not delivering certain policies, how well what it does corresponds with people's expectations, people's demands, people's kind of grievances. And the active legitimacy, again, making that more kind of connected with rebellious nature of civil society, is based on it's popular, it's direct, and it's immediate. It's popular because it's usually that active legitimacy in the form of rebellious society. It occurs when hundreds of thousands of people are mobilized on the streets, and in essentially via these collective actions, they are conferring legitimacy. It's direct because there's no really intermediaries. It's civil society and and political and power holders. There is no parliament. There is no political parties involved. They are kind of they may exist, but if we just focus on the rebellious civil society, they are kind of directly influencing the government, regardless of other political structures. It's immediate because it takes in real time. It's the mainstream influencing the political powers while they are there. Let's say protesting, demonstrating. Now, I wanted to touch upon the notion of the transitions, and we spoke a lot about the how freedom is won. The study. What element that is relevant to the discussion here from that study that I wanted to point out is, first of all, there were 50 transitions out of 67 that they were identified between 1972 and 2005 that they were driven by the kind of bottom-up mobilization. Out of these 50 transitions, 32 were very successful. They are free and democratic societies. And out of these 32, 22 of those transitions were so-called pactic transitions. What is meant by pactic transitions? Anyone? Right, they were negotiated. They were some kind of roundtable discussions between the opposition groups and the political power holders. So it's you could see that almost 70%, 75% of the very successful cases of democratic transitions actually they were led by some sort of negotiations between civil resistors and power holders. And this is the quote from today from demonstrators in Syria that I found online. We cannot have dialogue with papers and pens written by the tanks of the regime. It is a dishonorable dialogue. Despite the fact that there are more than 1,500 people that were killed so far in Syria, more than 10,000 people that were injured in prison, you have the notion among civil resistors of dialogue. We may want the regime down, but we also want to negotiate with the regime. If you look at the attributes of civil resistance, you will oftentimes find this notion of moderation. Civil resistance, by its nature, is magnanimous force. That's how I would see it. Because it's oftentimes very much open, despite the fact that it wants to bring the regime, it's very much open to negotiating with those pillars of support that are kind of shifting on the side of the civil resistors and want to implement the transition. And that's exactly what happened in Poland during the transition. Polish Solidarity movement, the civil resistance movement, was from its beginning very much based on this notion of dialogue and negotiations that would eventually take place with Communist Party, if only Communist Party agrees to that. And through various types of pressures, direct and indirect, based on those methods of nonviolent resistance that we have been studying in the last 2 days, the negotiations occurred. And the negotiations, how they were set up, they were very much set up on the principles not that guided Polish Communist Party, but that guided Solidarity. It was principle of equality of those sides, of both sides, principle of representation, and principle of consensus decision-making. You had 60 people sitting around this table. That was the main kind of table. However, there were more than 350 actors involved, half from the Communist Party, half from the Solidarity. But Solidarity was very well represented. There were workers represented, there were intellectuals, there were different professional groups, there were also church leaders involved in that process. I remember when the revolution occurred in Egypt, together with Lester Kurtz, professor from George Mason University, we published an article where we talked what would be the possible transition in Egypt. Would it be Tiananmen Square, or it would be the Polish Roundtable? Fortunately, Tiananmen didn't occur. Unfortunately, the Roundtable didn't happen either. It remains to be seen what will happen later. So one of the imprints of Solidarity, or one of the legacies of Solidarity and any civil resistance, it's this imprint of the magnanimous force reflected in kind of openness to negotiation with your opponent. That resulted in so many pacted transitions, including Poland. Another imprint that I saw in Poland in terms of linking civil resistance in the 80s with what happened at the beginning of the 90s, it was a philosophy of kind of effective organization and creative organization. After the roundtable discussions that, by the way, lasted 2 months, the elections were called in June, 2 months after the roundtable discussions, very quickly. Solidarity was faced with political campaign that they have never experienced before. The last time there was an open political campaign, it was in 1945 in Poland. And Solidarity used these organizational skills that they acquired during underground kind of work, during the civil resistance work, in that campaign. And the reflection or illustration of that creativity that Solidarity displayed, and I hope that the same would happen in Egypt, that there would be a lot of creativity done by the civic groups during this upcoming elections, that something, via that creativity would emerge that would contribute to the victory of the democratic forces in Egypt. In Poland, that was the main creative thing that came out during that political campaign that essentially was very effective in producing a kind of victory for Solidarity. What do you see here? Sheriff. Okay. And what does he have in his hand? Ballot. It's, you know, Polish culture was very, or Poles loved Westerners. Well, I mean, they just loved the kind of Hollywood culture, but they loved the kind of the issue of law and order, but true law and order that was, you know, brought to the West by sheriffs, and they thought that what Poland was lacking that time was law and order, and they used this kind of poster from it's Jerry Cooper from High Noon, Westerner, who comes to town to make an order. The solidarity comes to town to make an order. But in contrast to an American sheriff that would come to town very violently, this sheriff doesn't come with a revolver, doesn't come with a gun. It comes with a ballot box in his hand to make peaceful transition. Actually, you have to remember the presentation about Tiananmen Square. When Tiananmen Square occurred exactly? 1989 in June 4th. So this actually, and Poles were watching actually Tiananmen very closely. Particular Solidarity leaders that were quite concerned whether the Polish Communist Party would not react in the same way. And but because the trust during these 2 months of negotiations, there was quite a high amount of trust built during these roundtable negotiations, that eventually the deal was kept and the elections took place. And the elections took place before the fall of the Berlin Wall, because before any of the communist governments actually fell. That was the kind of major breakthrough, the first 3 elections. I wanted to touch upon the issue of leader and how civil resistance view the leader can influence the way future political system or constitutional system is designed, which I found quite relevant to Polish case, and perhaps you could think about how civil resistance should perhaps define the issue of leadership that may then influence the constitutional transition in your countries. This is from the Times. This is the kind of Western visualization of Lech Wałęsa. Lech Wałęsa, it was the kind of worker who became the head of the Solidarity movement at the beginning of the 80s. And this is the portrait of him by the Western media. How do you interpret this? What do you see in that picture?
Red to white.
Charisma.
The coloring of it.
Yeah.
From red to white or white to red, whatever.
Potential warmonger.
War.
Yeah, it's an element of disgust.
Yeah. Industrialization on one side. And
It's actually there are tanks and right.
Like that's the cover, and that's what he will eventually do. Yeah.
Right, so he was representing workers, so you've got factory and you've got the sign of solidarity on one hand, and then you've got the communist kind of vision of how to deal with the resistors. But the thing is that he is portrayed here as a kind of strongman, as a charismatic, non-violent warrior, right? And here are the pictures that Solidarity produced about Lech Wałęsa. Solidarity, members. What do you see in those pictures?
Oh, the second one is like true about.
It's what?
Yeah, it's like, this is what she's about.
Which one?
Second one.
One in the middle?
one in the middle, mustache.
Yeah.
Muscle mustache.
Okay.
I think is he dressed like James Bond or something?
No, well, what about this?
Like
a challenge.
They wish to portray him more like human, more like, so I would say kind and like ironic probably, but like more human.
Right.
Not that like strong Terminator.
He's strong, but he's also just like everyone else.
Exactly. Exactly. That's the kind of main portray.
Just like you, but he's strong.
Right. I mean, he's definitely.
He's strong.
And he's definitely a resistor here. And actually, that sign, it's a sign that one of the Polish sportsmen did in Moscow in 1980. The sign is actually a very rude gesture, yeah. And he did that in Moscow in 1980 during the Summer Olympics, and that was to Soviet people that were actually whistling at him because he won over it was a vault pole, you know, the competition, pole vault, and the Soviet sportsman came second, but that gesture, it was the gesture of defiance against the kind of the oppressive structure that came actually from Soviet Union and also shadowed Poland. And they used this gesture for like Wałęsa, but indeed Wałęsa is everyone man, as someone part of the people. So Solidarity members, they didn't see him as the caudillo, the one that would lead the nation really, although he was an important icon for the movement. And I think when we look at Polish constitutional system, it's quite interesting to see the position of a leader, of a political leader in Polish constitutional system. Because that political leader, president is still popularly elected, but president is very much also constrained by other branches of the government. Poles had a need for a visible leader. That's why they still elect in a popular vote president. One would expect, usually, if you have an election of a political leader in popular vote, that political leader would have a considerable powers. Actually, in Poland, that powers are quite limited by the executive system, by the prime minister, and by the government, and by the parliament. And I think, despite the fact that the Polish constitution is a very laborious document, it's very long, it set up certain balance between the vision of that Poles need a leader, but at the same time that Poles don't kind of view the leader they don't need to have a single leader that would have a concentration of power in his or her hands. And I think that if Egypt, which has also this notion of almost pharaonic leadership going back in history, it's looking for certain examples of constitutional order that on one hand would still keep the visible political leader in place, but that visible political leader would have limited powers, it would be, I think, quite wise to review Polish constitution. And you can access that on Google. It's in English as well. So despite, again, of being very laborious, I think that it provides certain balance in terms of how the power was deconcentrated. And I think it was, and since it was done by Solidarity movement, I think that the notion how they viewed Wałęsa during the struggle, unconsciously perhaps, was also reflected in the constitutional system that eventually emerged in Poland. Another important feature, which is connected with also how Solidarity viewed political power. Solidarity was very decentralized movement, although it had this leadership. But despite the fact that Wałęsa was put in house arrest for a couple of years at the beginning of the 80s, Solidarity didn't die. It didn't die because it was very decentralized. It was based on the local workers' councils. It was based on different civic associations at different regions. And the notion of decentralization, once Solidarity came to power, also stayed as a kind of practical, as a possible reform that should be implemented in Poland. And very quickly, within 2 months after Solidarity came to power, one observed the set of legislative acts that decentralized very quickly Poland, established kind of self-governing councils on the local level. And what was interesting, that they set up a civic foundation with that reform responsible for doing training and education of the local officials, elected and as well as the kind of administrative officials of those local councils. So again, the kind of imprint of how Solidarity looked like was reflected in the emerging political kind of system in Poland. the kind of central feature of the society in Poland, which why I think it's the continuous rebellious nature of civil society is important for the successful democratization. Actually, between 1989 and 1993, Poland had at least 8,000 strikes, protests, and demonstrations every year during that time.
Say it again.
It was between 7,000 and 8,000 strikes in Poland every year between 1989 and 1983. So Solidarity came to power, and society was not satisfied with that. They actually were rebelling against the government once it came to power. They were restless during the crucial years of the transition. Now, they oftentimes, they were restless because the economic reforms, hardship of the socio-economic reforms, they were demanding their kind of economic social rights to be preserved. But at the same time, their demands were very limited. They were, we would call them kind of reformist protests rather than destructive protests. I would even venture to the notion of creative protests because they, in contrast to some people which would say that any protest demonstrations during transition actually done also by the people that wanted democracy in the first place, they shouldn't happen. They should be actually quiet down. The leaders are in power. They should give them a chance to govern and implement reforms rather than demand kind of particularistic interest. And I think that despite this perceived instability, actually the notion of rebellious civil society strengthened political system because that political system didn't have yet mature political parties and didn't have yet mature political system. And somehow rebellious civil society constituted a certain safety valve for the transition to move forward and for the transition to be successful while political system, political space was being organized. And at the same time, solidarity leaders in the government, they responded in a very kind of benign manner and non-coercive manner to those protests. They didn't try to use police or military to suppress those protests. They kind of accepted them and they tried to negotiate with the protesters. So in essence, also they took the values, fortunately, that kind of developed within this civil resistance movement to the government in terms of how they would interact with that rebellious civil society. Finally, the civic empowerment, which could be rooted in civil resistance in the 80s. The number of civic organizations skyrocketed after 1989. And what was quite important, the solidarity movement, which is, when you look at civil resistance in Arab countries, it actually led to the emergence of feminist movement in Poland. A number of leaders, solidarity leaders, were arrested at the beginning of the 80s. As I mentioned with Lech Wałęsa, there were around 3,000 solidarity leaders in prison and detained during the martial law in 1981. The positions in the solidarity movement then were taken by women. Women entered the movement when the men were arrested. Perhaps then, that arrest wasn't too bad. I mean, first of all, women entered the movement, and second of all, those leaders had time to rethink a couple of things when they were sitting in the prisons, particularly of how to do the transition. And from that point, women stayed very active. And when Poland entered kind of democratic transition, they formed a number of organizations, and they formed very strong feminist voice in Poland. In support of democratic values as well as in support of women's rights and promotion of women's rights vis-a-vis of strong kind of conservative currents that were then taking place and advocated by Catholic Church. I will stop here. There are other imprints in Poland that one can think of, for example, Polish foreign policy, which I think was shaped very much by the values of solidarity. But this is a couple of thoughts that I had regarding the transition. I know that Mary wanted to say a few words about negotiations and transition, and I'm not sure, Mary, if you would like to take right now time to do that.
I thank you very much. And I want to go back to what Jack said about you're going to leave here as teachers. Well, if you're going to leave here as teachers, there are a couple of things, a couple of thoughts troubling me, things I need to share with you. I will not part from you without sharing a couple of things with you. And building on that magnificent presentation, could you bring back the picture of the Polish Roundtable, please, Justice Motif? Thank you. The reaching of negotiations is often extremely portentous for a nonviolent movement. I mentioned on Tuesday that the 1987 Intifada wanted a negotiated settlement. Implicit in that was a recognition of Israel. Implicit in that was an acceptance of partition. You would never have known that from reading the US press. But anyone who really understood the situation understood how significant it was that the Palestinians inside the territories were ready to sit down in negotiations. What's really important for you to take with you after the session we had on negotiations is that they're not some discombobulated thing floating over a social movement like a cloud. Often the only way that a nonviolent mobilization, which is asymmetrical in power, it's weak in conventional terms vis-a-vis its target group. I will not use the word enemy. Its target group, its opponent, or its adversary. The only way it can reach negotiations is through nonviolent struggle. From that position of asymmetry, to use violence does nothing except to unite the target group in opposition to the movement. So if you want to consolidate your opponent, use violence. It will unite them. If you want to split their ranks and make it easier to get to negotiations, nonviolent struggle is really the only way to do it. Now, once you sit down with the target group, this is very important to take with you. If the target group does not grasp that its power is going to be dependent on the obedience and the cooperation of its people, if it hasn't shifted its understanding of the nature of power, it's very unlikely that those negotiations are going to come to any results. But there's another matter that I want to pick up. Professor Ruhama used the word threats when he talked about the negotiators. Negotiators are actually trained in the arts of deception, concealment, bluffing, putting out maximal demands in order later to be able to climb down and accept compromise. These are not the arts needed for a successful popular mobilization, a mobilization of popular sovereignty, popular defiance. We'll go back to Roxanne's question of the first day about honesty. Why do you think Gandhi always wrote to Lord Irwin, the Viceroy of India, the representative of the British Raj, the British realm? Why do you think he always wrote to him and advised what the movement was prepared to do? Laid it all out. If he could succeed in getting the British crown to change without doing anything, simply by saying this is what we are prepared to do, it's not a threat. It was, this is our plan. If he could succeed simply by sharing this information, that would be preferable. In civil resistance, all you have is the people involved. You cannot afford to squander them. You're trying to get somebody to stop doing something or start doing something. If you can achieve it through a petition, all the better, because you cannot squander those human resources. The pastors' movement in East Germany. In East Germany, exit, which we talked about this morning, was one of the nonviolent methods, but also mass demonstrations that came from the churches, the Protestant churches, starting in 1982, ratifying a very important point that you made. In 1982, the first demonstration proceeds from a Protestant church in Leipzig. It's not until 1989 that the demonstrations are more than 250,000, 300,000, and upwards of that. And eventually the party decides to open the wall. Gorbachev doesn't even come to power until 1985. So those of you who are thinking Gorby did it, please. But in the churches, the pastors had a rule. You must stand up and identify yourself by name. Because with the Stasi secret police everywhere, people wanted to protect themselves by concealing their identity. And so within the movement in the churches, they said the first thing is, you stand up and say, I am Frau Marta from such and such village. You identify yourself because it is flying right in the face of the secret police. It is the opposite of concealment. It is full disclosure, full honesty. I was telling Jack yesterday that in my job working with the press in the U.S. civil rights movement, we had our own system, but we also worked with the establishment press. And we would systematically underestimate our numbers. Never exaggerate, underestimate. And then I got to the point where, after President Kennedy was killed in 1963, I'm 23 years old. All I have is a bachelor's degree. I know how to write a press release. Not very much more than that to offer to the movement. But we finally got to the point where I could call the New York Times and let them know that the bodies of 5 black men had turned up, floating in the rivers around Natchez, Mississippi, and it was in the New York Times the next day. Because of a policy of de-emphasizing the numbers, depressing the numbers, never exaggerating them. So one's credibility is critically, vitally important. Javier Cecilia last night, what would he gain by exaggeration? His clarity of communications, his bare, naked honesty is his biggest tool. Don't forget this. Movements propel their leaders. And one of the things they need to have is crystal clear communications. It's very, very fundamental to civil resistance. The behaviors for which negotiators are trained are not the behaviors that will allow your movement to reach negotiations. Please hold on to these thoughts. Thank you.